So what you're about to hear from Dr. Richard Wolff is a concession. He's been forced into concession on not only living standards, but on wages. Listen carefully to this.
Yeah, you have billionaires writing op-eds. The
Absolutely.
pitchforks are coming for the plutocrats because
Exactly.
they know what's coming. Let's talk about the bubbles. You're talking about the housing bubble, and I think that this is a really interesting indication. The housing crisis, the crisis of overproduction, the fact that we have more houses than we do homeless people. But because you had this crisis of overproduction, too much of something was produced and people couldn't utilize it. I mean, talk about that concept and why this is an inescapable phenomenon under capitalism.
Starting in the 1970s, American businesses began to have what I like to call a eureka moment. They realized that in the West, North America, Western Europe, and Japan, 100 and 200 years of capitalism had built up impressive factories, offices, stores. But they were built up in the places where capitalism was born, Western Europe, North America, and Japan. That's where they had concentrated everything. And that's where they had drawn workers in off the countryside to become urban, industrialized working classes. And along the way, the workers, noticing how productive capitalism was since they did the work, demanded for themselves a rising standard of living. So roughly, from 1820 to 1970, particularly in the United States but elsewhere, wages rose.
So there you have Dr. Richard Wolff more or less being forced into a concession that during the Industrial Revolution time period, and even right up to 1970, you pretty much saw the living standards improve, as of course the wages, and he's basically being forced into concession that yes, it was down to capitalism that was responsible for that. So how then can he go on to say this?
That's what, over that time, capitalists were doing so well they could raise the wages of their workers and still make out like bandits.
And that is just completely illogical to me. Makes no rational sense. It ignores the fact that they greatly improved people's living standards as a whole. It was thanks to capitalism, thanks to competition and business reputation and the machines that were innovated, thanks to all the capital and the mass production that enabled capitalism to greatly reduce the working hours of people, not because of some government. Capitalism did greatly improve, not just their wages, but of course improved their living standards and gave them a more luxurious lifestyle because they had more free time to do other things. So this is what I don't understand. Capitalism greatly reduced the working hours, it greatly improved the wages, their living standards as a whole, but then he says they made out like bandits. Illogical.
So it was a system in which people began to get the idea capitalism works. It delivers the goods because it raises wages. You had to not look at what was happening to where most people in the world lived, Asia, Africa, Latin America, because for them the situation was horrible.
And so he talks about, the likes of Latin America, Asia, Africa, as if to say, it was because of the United States of America that's responsible for other places in the world being in poverty. Just listen very carefully to this, because he goes on about the likes of the Asian countries, the, Latin America. These countries were rife with socialism in many regards. And like I've pointed out before, it wasn't until 1977 China began to turn towards capitalism. They haven't turned truly towards the capitalism we support, which is of course within the free market. The government's trying so hard to try and make government intervention work, and it's not working. So just listen very carefully to this.
But if you concentrated on where capitalism was born, you could fool yourself into thinking, wow, this is a system that works. And the capitalists, of course, and the people who liked it celebrated all of that. Then in the 1970s, capitalists had this eureka moment. They said to themselves, wait a minute, we're in North America, Western Europe, and Japan, where the wages are now very high. Workers are very happy. But why are we here? In the rest of the world, which has been savaged by the growth of capitalism in those privileged areas, wages are very low.
So there you have, he's basically saying the savage of capitalism left other countries with low wages, despite the fact that the Latin American countries were flirting with socialism, such as example in the 1970s you saw Communist Allende of Chile basically flirting with socialism. He nationalised most of their economy, fixing prices and wages, and as a result of that their country hit hyperinflation. How convenient of him to ignore that fact. One important fact, however, is they love to say, oh well, it was all the fault of the United States of America, it's the fault of the intervention of the CIA and of course the military coup in, September of 1973.
In September of 1973, General of the Army Augusto Pinochet led a coup d'etat against the Allende government. As the army moved in, Salvador Allende committed suicide. In less than a day, a military junta controlled Chile, and Pinochet was proclaimed president.
The problem with that argument is the fact that, well, evidence proves the hyperinflation was already there by late 1972, a whole year before the likes of the CIA and the military coup got involved with regards to Chile's mess. It, devastated an oil-rich country of Venezuela. I think they were sitting about 40th odd on the Freedom Index at one point. Hugo Chavez steps in, the so-called democratic socialist, and before you know it, after he's finished with them, they're sitting about 174th on the Freedom Index by 2013, and their country had faced blackouts, food shortages long before their claim about an oil drop, the oil prices dropped. Long before then, even the African continent that was flirting with Marxism and Leninism for decades. Just listen to this.
So in this eureka moment, capitalists said, what are we doing here in Western Europe, North America, and Japan? It's much more profitable if we produce in China, in India, in Brazil, anywhere else.
One of the very big reasons for why China was a country they turned to get China to produce things for them was simply because they could not afford to produce it themselves. The likes of Great Britain, even the likes of the United States to some regards, were moving in the opposite direction of capitalism, of basically the manufacturing based economy. And we saw this between the 1920s right up to the 1970s into the era of Margaret Thatcher and of course Ronald Reagan. The reason for why the United States, especially Great Britain, was moving in that direction is because they could not afford to produce more. And do you want to know why? Their country was suffering as a result of all the government intervention that led us to 2 world wars that bankrupted our nation. Our nation was in a severe mess. In Britain, we lost our superpower status. Our nation had to borrow large sums of money, and this was exactly what was happening in the United States as well. As a result of all of that, you now see the United States of America sitting more than $20 trillion in debt. No different to the United Kingdom sitting more than £8.6 trillion in debt. Your country in a consumer-driven based economy needs manufacturing. You need someone to do it for you. The likes of Britain could not afford to produce. We were losing that status. We had no choice but to move in the opposite direction.
And there begins what we're still in the middle of, the exodus, the abandonment of the places of origin of capitalism by the capitalists. So there's a massive move to China, India, Brazil, and all those places, producing what? Well, what every capitalist wants, which is to make a bundle. So they build big factories, imagining that they can sell all of this stuff like they used to.
So the big problem with this argument, it doesn't seem to understand the laws of supply and demand, because if you get the likes of China or India or these other countries like Brazil, if you get them to mass produce, the more that you produce in quantity, the lower the costs of those goods and services. So those products become cheaper because there's more of it to go around. But listen carefully to what he's about to say here.
But they forgot something. If you go from high wages in the United States to low wages in China, the bottom line is that the people earning wages are earning a lot less than they used to. It's not just that they're not Americans, they're Chinese, but they can't buy back what you're building. They can't manage to consume what you have the capacity to produce. Right now, China is slowing down, scaring the whole world. But it's not China that's slowing down. It's the inability of China to sell to the world because the wages of the world's workers have been depressed now for years as we move out of Western Europe, North America, and Japan into these lower. And the system totters as it encounters a very old contradiction in its current form for which they have no solution.
And there you have it. Like I pointed out from the statistics, proving that people's, wages had been continuously improving, he's been contradicted by that. And as I said, he just doesn't understand that the mass production leads to cheaper costs of goods and services. So yes, they can actually afford, and they have actually been buying more as a result of that. The wealth as a whole has been dramatically improving. As a result, when these countries began, like for example India, moving away from the socialism, on a scale when you move further in a direction towards capitalism, your economy performs better.
Just a few short years ago, China was the world's most exciting growth story, constantly beating expectations. And India was the growth story that never seemed to play out the way it was supposed to.
Well, India's had a long record of disappointing growth after independence until it began to make reforms in 1991.
Well, we saw that in China, we saw that in the likes of India, and of course, we see that in other countries. Perhaps in the likes of Great Britain, you're seeing people getting paid lower paid wages and wages are being suppressed, and the problem in Europe, because like he goes on to explain, just listen to this.
And right now, when it's happening on a global scale, Europe is having it, North America is having it, Japan. These are the centers of capitalism. They're in the most trouble right now, and they don't see a way out, and I don't either, which makes it possible, for the first time in my life, to begin to see a capitalism that is in fundamental shaking difficulty.
It's like I touched upon before with the immigration crisis. That's why Europe is facing the problem that it is in recent years. Because of the immigration crisis of these lower skilled workers who are flooding into these countries who have, welfare states, and especially Britain who has things like the NHS, etc. So of course you're going to suppress wages when you're flooding into the country. More immigrants. I mean, there's 350,000 people who were flooding through the door. I mean, and the supply of housing and education and healthcare, all of that cannot keep up. Your economy cannot sustain that.